Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, and today we are doing the third installment of the Elizabeth Holmes trial update, or Theranos trial, whatever you want to call it. My last video was recorded on October 5th, I think, so if you'd like to catch up, you can watch that one here, or if you haven't watched any of these, the first video I'll link here as well. So we're going to cover through the events of the 7th week of trial, I believe. There's been so much going on, and I think going forward, I'm going to try to do a bit more regular updates so the videos are a little bit shorter because this took a ton of time to compile everything, and I feel like a lot of stuff I'm going to be going through in a little bit of a summary, and sometimes you'd like to dig a little deeper into stuff. So I think what I'm going to do, this is covering the events of October 6th through the 22nd. And after this, I'm probably just going to do a weekly update going forward. But anyway, let's dive into everything that has happened in the past couple weeks in this trial. So first of all, at the time of the last video, I believe we had one jury member who had been removed. This was because the young woman had work conflicts that she couldn't really navigate. And since then, two more jurors have been removed from the trial. One requested to leave because of her Buddhist faith. She believed that she couldn't really deal with the consequences of potentially convicting someone. She said the guilt over that would, be too difficult to deal with. So she was released. However, on Friday the 22nd, I think another juror was let go for playing Sudoku in the courtroom for between 7 to 10 days of testimony. And so she said that she's really fidgety and that, she needs to do something with her hands. It helps her pay attention. However, there were a lot of other juror complaints about this. I think, people believed she just wasn't paying attention. So the judge ultimately dismissed her as well. So 3 jurors might not seem like a lot, but we're only halfway through the trial, and at the beginning of the trial, they only had 5 alternates. So now we're only down to 2. So the big thing here is that if they run out of alternates and something happens with the jury, it will lead to a mistrial, which means that pretty much everything that's happened, they have to do all over again. So I think from now on through the rest of the trial, they're going to make sure they can do everything they can to make sure that we have all the members of the jury. So, like I said, there's been a ton of information. I had to kind of summarize some things, so I'm going to be doing a little bit of reading from my notes. And I got a lot of sources from Wall Street Journal updates and New York Times updates. If you'd like to see where some of this information is coming from, I'll link it in the description below. We left off with the testimony of Adam Rosendorf, the Theranos lab director, and he testified like a marathon, 6 days. It's been the longest testimony so far. Now, directly after him, we heard from Stephen Bird, who was the CEO of Safeway for about 2 decades. And Safeway was one of the stores that tried to have a contract with Theranos to try to get those blood testing machines in the Safeway stores. So he was the 10th prosecution witness, and he testified that he met Elizabeth Holmes in 2010, and Safeway spent about $350 million building clinics in hundreds of its stores in anticipation of putting the blood testing company's devices inside the stores. So U.S. Attorney Robert Leach, who is one of the prosecutors, talked about how that dollar amount, that $350 million, showed the seriousness with which Safeway took Ms. Holmes' representations about her company and its technology. And again, we get the kind of description about Mr. Bird meeting Elizabeth and how she was very charismatic. He said that he initially had a lot of admiration for her, and she was one of the most impressive entrepreneurs that he had ever met, and she was confident, decisive, and warm. She was clearly charismatic, he said. She was very smart. And so initially he really liked her. They entered into this agreement, but there were problems relatively soon, I would say. Theranos repeatedly pushed back their launch date to be in Safeway stores. And in my opinion, this is kind of a good thing because, Safeway never actually got the Edison machines in the stores and didn't have the type of potential patient dangerous outcomes like Walgreens had when they did put Theranos machines in their stores. So it was kind of a red flag that, the date for the launch kept being pushed back further and further. Another important point of Mr. Bird's testimony is that it undercuts the idea that Elizabeth deferred to Sonny in a lot of the business dealings. Mr. Bird testified that Ms. Holmes appeared to him to be unquestionably in charge at Theranos. He said that when he spoke with Ms. Holmes and Mr. Balwani together, she answered questions confidently herself and didn't consult with her deputy. His dealings were directly with Ms. Holmes rather than a deputy or a Theranos lawyer. She supplied him with presentations about Theranos technology for the Safeway board and emailed him updates. So with Elizabeth, Mr. Bird personally negotiated the 2010 agreement to install Theranos devices in Safeway stores, which included Safeway investing at least $10 million for convertible notes that would convert to equity in Theranos. And so what was unusual about it was that we never saw an attorney, Mr. Bird testified. Ms. Holmes was leading the effort completely on her own, he said. Not all CEOs are alike. She would rise to the top of the pile in terms of vision, in terms of command of information, clearly in terms of delivery. She was always decisive. Whenever she was talking, she owned the room. Now, this is really important because if we remember what the defense is trying to do is paint Elizabeth as the visionary leader of the company, but who might not have been involved in those types of day-to-day decisions that led to fraud and misinformation being let out. However, you're going to see again and again in testimony from the prosecution's witnesses that they say Elizabeth was directly in charge of all of these things. She was very in command of the information, and she was the one who made the final decisions, not Sonny Balwani. Mr. Bird also said that Ms. Holmes' intense secrecy about Theranos at times was perplexing. As a part of a rollout strategy for their partnership, the companies were going to launch an under-the-radar test in a market that didn't have a lab run by Laboratory Corp of America or Quest Diagnostics, Theranos' largest competitors. That excluded rolling out a test in Northern California where Safeway was headquartered, which really inconvenienced Mr. Bird and his staff. The test market launch never happened, and by then, the stalled partnership dissolved after reporting from the Wall Street Journal in 2015. So that was the reporting by John Carreyrou. So in the negotiations between Safeway and Theranos, that was an early red flag, like I said, all the pushing back of the launch date. And apparently, Elizabeth brought a Theranos blood testing machine to a Safeway board meeting in March 2011 to demonstrate this technology to Safeway. And board member Michael Shannon volunteered to have his finger pricked through the Theranos' signature blood drawing method. And the blood was extracted from Mr. Shannon's finger, deposited into a cartridge, and put into the device. And so it was a prostate-specific antigen or PSA screening, basically a test to detect prostate cancer. And the machine made a bunch of noise, but never came up with a result, Mr. Bird testified. He said that Ms. Holmes said something that made us think we would get it later, and they never did get it. So this is something that kind of came up multiple times when Theranos would, use its device and test it out on people. They did this for Safeway and Walgreens. And, if you're going to invest in something or partner with something, you might want a practical demonstration of the thing. And there were always all these excuses that they gave about why they couldn't give the results of the blood tests. And even one time, I can't remember if it was for Safeway or Walgreens, but I read that they said that since it wasn't ordered by a doctor, they couldn't release the information or something like that. And another really interesting thing is that an excuse that Elizabeth had for why there were all of these pushbacks for the launch date of Safeway was military contracts. So she was using the excuse of them, launching Theranos with the Department of Defense as an excuse for why it couldn't launch in Safeway, when actuality that wasn't happening. It was just an excuse and a lie. Another thing that we see that kind of soured the Safeway relationship was an email that prosecutors displayed. Apparently, Mr. Bird said, Safeway risked soiling its own lab reputation because of Theranos' sloppiness. Blood samples were lost or stored at the wrong temperature. The test results didn't make any sense. And Theranos results were taking 3 to 5 days to return to patients. And that's, much longer than the 20 minutes that they were promised. And that kind of makes this doing the whole thing in stores kind of inconvenient The idea was that you would go in there, do your test, do your shopping, and then leave with the results of your test. But if it's taking 3 to 5 days, that clearly isn't going to be possible. So apparently in November of 2012, Mr. Bird sent an email to Ms. Holmes with the subject, "Becoming discouraged." He wrote, "As I'm sure you know, I'm not easily discouraged. In fact, I can only recall having been discouraged once in the last 62 years. That said, I'm getting close to my second event." In court, he testified that his email was not hyperbole. "I'm one of the most positive people you'll ever meet. I don't get discouraged." So that's kind of the information that we got from the prosecution. Now, during the cross-examination, there was kind of a lot of back and forth going over the Theranos lab setup. I guess Bird was frustrated that they were supposed to have the box, the Edison testing machine, one of Theranos's blood analyzers, but for secrecy reasons, they didn't get one. One of the defense attorneys kind of grilled Bird on legal details about their partnership that gave Safeway exclusivity in some areas, and again, whether there was ever a hard deadline for the launch date. There was a lot of focus on the diligence that Safeway did on Theranos and its technology, because, if you can make the argument as the defense that, these companies didn't actually do their due diligence, then the burden of responsibility might fall on them instead of Elizabeth and Theranos for providing that wrong information and kind of trying to cover things up. So I guess Bird spoke with various doctors and lab directors at Johns Hopkins who said that they'd not had Theranos machines long enough to validate them. And again, too, kind of trying to shift the blame onto Bird for maybe not knowing better. The defense attorney is saying, you knew at the time that she was a very young entrepreneur, you knew the company was a startup, kind of contrasting the experience of Safeway with Theranos. Even though, it was a startup, yes, but it was also getting hundreds of millions of dollars from investors, and they claimed that they were so much further along than they were. So this is kind of that cognitive dissonance, in my opinion, of claiming, oh, it's just a little baby company, it's just a little startup, they didn't know what they were doing. Meanwhile, they're touting themselves as on the cutting edge of technology and, saying that we have X amount of partnerships, we've been approved by, X people, we've partnered with all of these different groups. So it doesn't really make sense in my mind to just say, oh, they were a little startup, because they were saying that they had all of these things and, they fooled a lot of people. So the next person to testify is the former Walgreens CFO, Wade McQuillan. I think that's how you say his name. And he wanted to partner with Elizabeth Holmes starting in 2010. An important piece in his decision to partner with them was the fact that Theranos said that they had 3 pharmaceutical companies that had performed due diligence on them. And while that might be true, there were some, we'll see later, that basically said that they didn't pass muster, and Theranos lied about that. Again, the relationship kind of went sour when Theranos missed key partnerships, and this culminated in a lawsuit filed by Walgreens in 2016, alleging that Theranos misled it about the startup's technology, and I believe Theranos did settle with that, and Walgreens got, I believe, $30 million in the settlement, but it became very clear that Theranos didn't really have that much money, so I'm not sure how much of that was paid out or if it was paid by insurance. But regardless, Walgreens already invested a lot of money into this partnership, so I don't really think they came out on top. Interestingly, one of the diligence reports that Ms. Holmes sent to Walgreens, which prosecutors presented in court, included a logo of pharmaceutical company Sharing Plow Corp. And in the second line of the report, the word institute was misspelled in the company's name as Sharing Plow Research Institute. And apparently Mr. McQuillan said that he hadn't noticed the misspelling at the time. But I think that might lead people to believe that this due diligence report maybe wasn't accurate. So Walgreens agreed to pay Theranos $140 million for this partnership, including $100 million that was kind of like an innovation fee, basically because they were such a new, young company. And it was interesting because they kind of had an agreed upon date for when they would pay this money. However, Holmes requested that Walgreens accelerate the $100 million payment, and this fee kind of hinged on them meeting certain milestones, which they hadn't done yet. But Holmes emailed Walgreens asking to accelerate the payment anyway, and I think this is probably because they were running out of money. It was kind of interesting that Mr. McQuillan was such a staunch advocate for Elizabeth, even when some of this negative press started to come out. So in 2015, after some of those Wall Street Journal articles, he wrote in an email to Elizabeth, "You are in my thoughts, hang in there. The haters are everywhere, but your contribution to the world cannot be bottled up." So he was still very much on board with her, even when all of this was going on. So it kind of took, I think, a lot more concrete evidence for him to realize that she had not quite been truthful. The next witness is Robert Amenta, who is the deputy chief investigator at the New York Federal Reserve. And he basically just walked the jury through what a wire transfer is, and what wire fraud is. So wire fraud is defined by the Justice Department as the use of interstate communications to defraud someone. So in Ms. Holmes' case, many of the wire fraud counts involve transfers of money from investors to Theranos, which prosecutors say Ms. Holmes procured by lying about the capabilities of her company's blood testing technology. So basically just kind of further explaining to the jury what the counts are, what they're trying to find Elizabeth Holmes guilty of, and basically contextualizing that information for them. Next, we have another Walgreens executive, Mr. Javeri, who worked with Mrs. Holmes and Sunny Balwani in order to kind of process this Walgreens deal. So a lot of this testimony kind of talked about how Walgreens was unhappy with the number of patients having blood draws from arms instead of the finger prick tests that Theranos, had said that they were going to do. So according to this filing, Mr. Balwani told Mr. Javeri that the reasons for the high number of vein draws included a problem with cartridges used in the blood tests, and that Theranos competitors were sending people into Walgreens stores to order tests that required venous draws, and that doctors were ordering esoteric tests that couldn't be done with finger pricks. Apparently, Mr. Balwani told Mr. Javeri that Theranos Technologies was being used by the military. The court filing shows a misrepresentation that has been raised by multiple witnesses in the trial so far. So again, we see just kind of excuses for why they're not doing the things they promised they said they were going to do. So in February 2014, a few months after the partnership launched, 43% of patients were still having venous draws, according to documents, and that proportion fell a little bit to 39% by May 2014. But that number is still way too high for what they were promising to do. So Walgreens was trying to get that number to zero, and Sunny Balwani assured Walgreens the percentage of venous draws would fall below 5% by the end of 2014. That never happened. Mr. Javeri said that Mr. Balwani told Walgreens that Theranos was still learning the patterns of what types of tests doctors were ordering, which was hampering the ability to do more fingerstick tests. No one was satisfied with the high percentage, Mr. Javeri said, including Mr. Balwani. And now, this is kind of interesting. There was a little bit of a theatrical twist with Mr. Javeri's testimony. I feel like the reason why the prosecution chose to do this here is because Mr. Javeri had most of his dealings with Sunny Balwani, which kind of goes towards the defense's argument that Elizabeth wasn't involved in these types of negotiations. So they used him to do a dramatic reading of some texts between Sunny and Elizabeth. So one of the prosecutors played Elizabeth, and Mr. Javeri played the role of Sunny. So they just read the texts back and forth to each other. And, there were some of these that were like, "Oh, I love you," and whatnot. And so a lot of people in the courtroom had some chuckles over this. Like I said, I think that this was kind of to show that Elizabeth was still involved and that Sunny wasn't super controlling. If you are interested in reading some of those texts, there were 36 pages now, I believe, that have been introduced into evidence, so I have those linked in the description below as well. Some of the more damning text messages read, "Okay, WAG freaking out, lack of transparency," Mr. Javeri read, and so that was from a text sent October 16th, 2015, referring to Walgreens' reactions to the journal's reporting. In a series of texts, Mr. Balwani said Walgreens was unhappy learning things about Theranos in the media and not from the company directly, including a problem Theranos faced with regulators. So again, during the cross-examination, the defense pretty much hammered home the idea that Elizabeth didn't have many dealings with this person from Walgreens. So he said that he met her only 2 or 3 times at most, and he worked mostly with Sunny Balwani, which kind of bolsters their claim that Elizabeth wasn't involved with these things. Another thing they tried to show was that patient satisfaction was pretty high with their experience with Theranos tests at Walgreens. I think it was 4.81 out of 5. However, it is important to note that these patient satisfaction surveys only have to deal with their experience inside the Walgreens. This doesn't account for when they actually got the results of their tests. So, all those people who had those wrong or inaccurate test results, they found that out after they provided their satisfaction with the testing procedures. Another interesting witness who came up was Mr. Sunil Dewan, who was a dermatologist, actually Sunny Balwani's dermatologist for 15 years, who filled in as kind of a temporary lab director after Adam Rosendorf left. So he had this kind of weird role where he was the lab director, but he only, did maybe 5 to 10 hours of work for Theranos over a long period of time. He signed off on a lot of lab report documents, but they also had another doctor, Dr. Lynette Sawyer, doing kind of the same job. It was very weird and confusing to me, and the process didn't really make much sense. I'm not sure if they had him there to just kind of be a figurehead and sign off on things, but it was just kind of weird that he was there for a short amount of time, did really not that much work, but I think on one Saturday he signed off on like 300 different lab results, and he said he only felt comfortable doing that because they'd already previously been signed off by Adam Rosendorf. So, like I said, the whole thing's just a little weird. Okay, so another Theranos employee who took the stand last Friday afternoon, Daniel Edlin, was actually a college friend of Elizabeth Holmes' brother Christian, who also worked at Theranos. So Christian, I guess, kind of had this habit of recruiting his Duke fraternity brothers to work at Theranos, and the whole group of them were kind of called like the Thera Bros. So I guess Daniel Edlin worked there for 5 or 6 years, I believe. And he kind of had a role in a lot of different areas of the company. He led tours at one point, was involved in, preparing information to send out to investors. He was also involved in the project with trying to get Theranos out in the military. So he was really useful in talking to how Theranos operated in a lot of these different areas. And apparently he left in December of 2016 because he said, "I no longer believed based on what I was seeing that the company was capable of standing behind the claims it had been making about its technology." So he was one of those people who in the beginning really believed in what they were doing, but after a while realized that those claims, weren't really holding up. For example, when they were doing demonstrations for potential investors and people like that, they had this demo app, which pretty much, if you were running this demo app, it wouldn't show that there was an error going on in the test result, or how the Edison was functioning. So Mr. Edlin thought that that was maybe a little disingenuous to have an app that wouldn't show an error message if in fact there was an error going on with the testing. So, U.S. Attorney John Bostic asked if that meant that, like, even if there was an error preventing the machine from returning a result, it would appear to still be working for those who are watching the test. And Mr. Edlin responded right in his testimony. So that's pretty much what was going on. And at the time of this demonstration, Mr. Bostic asked, was this a month or less until Theranos began offering testing services? Yes, Mr. Edlin responded. So this is only one example of this kind of deception that we've seen. And there were a bunch of back and forth with different email chains again, in which Daniel Young instructed Edlin to change or remove abnormal test results from demo reports, and Elizabeth Holmes was included on many of these emails. So Edlin testifies that Holmes was very involved and detail-oriented in reviewing and approving Theranos' marketing for the end product and for what actually went on the website. She did review that. So again, we have testimony that Elizabeth isn't directly involved in a lot of these things. So Edlin would prepare information that would go to investors, and Elizabeth would review it. Apparently, she never flagged or took out language that we now know is completely misleading or false. Mr. Edlin testified that a reason Ms. Holmes gave him for why the devices were never deployed in the military was that resources at Theranos were being directed towards the clinical launch in Walgreens. So she's just flipping the excuse, oh, they're not being used in the military because we're focusing on the retail. Meanwhile, she was telling the retailers, oh, we're having troubles meeting the launch dates because we're focusing on the military. So it was just complete, stalling tactics and misleading. So I guess this is really interesting. In the years-long discussions between Theranos and the US Defense Department about ways to deploy the startup's blood testing technology, one concern the military had was how the devices performed in high temperatures. So I guess Daniel Edlin said that he'd asked several department heads whether any data existed on how Theranos devices performed in different temperatures. And in March 2013, he circulated some of what he'd learned to Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes. Nope, the Edison did not have a way to cool down and would shut down in higher temperatures, one Theranos employee told Mr. Edlin. Another said the device had to operate in an environment between 72 and 82 degrees or risked performance problems. This is a problem because obviously it gets above 82 degrees in a lot of the places where the US has military operations around the world. Apparently, Daniel Young, Theranos' top scientist, wrote in June 2012, 48 hours of continual testing of the reader at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, completed successfully tonight. We ran 100 protocols sequentially, so I feel very good about the reliability for this deployment. So apparently there was some testing of these machines in high temperatures, but honestly, I don't really know if I believe that they said that it worked, because we know from them just trying to run tests in a clinical lab environment, presumably in normal temperatures, that the machines weren't working properly or weren't giving proper test results. So if it's supposed to run in a certain temperature range, I don't really see how it was still performing well in these really, really hot climates. It just seems like something doesn't add up to me. And again, we have evidence from Mr. Edlin about, if he ever saw Mr. Balwani overrule Ms. Holmes, and he said that he couldn't recall a specific moment, and if anything, Sonny would defer to Elizabeth a lot for decisions. Now, in the cross-examination of this, the defense presented a couple times where Elizabeth tried to clarify language or, say that we have to be accurate about such and such. And it's true, there were times where she tried to make sure that things were more accurate, but there were a lot of examples where, they didn't have the ability to make valid claims. So in my opinion, she lied. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is testimony from a Pfizer employee and this report that Pfizer did when Theranos was trying to partner with them. Pretty interestingly, for the past couple weeks, the defense was trying to fight, to keep this report out of the jury's eyes, because I think it's pretty damning. We can see here that the report concluded that Pfizer had no interest in using Theranos' technology. And the report included lines like, Theranos has been excessively pushy in accessing new points of contact once turned down by an existing point of contact. And Theranos has provided non-informative, tangential, deflective, or evasive answers to a written set of technical due diligence questions. And, U.S. Attorney Robert Leach pretty much says this is definitive proof of Ms. Holmes' lie. This is proof that Pfizer, did not validate Theranos, because if you guys remember, some of the material that Theranos provided to investors had like a Pfizer logo on it, and they said that they were approved by Pfizer, which this report shows is categorically not the case. So on Friday, we heard testimony from Shane Weber. And so he was one of the people who was involved in doing this kind of due diligence report. So he reviewed a document from Theranos that presented findings from a 15-month study beginning in 2007 that measured how 27 late-stage cancer patients responded to treatment. The Theranos devices were provided to patients to use at home, and their data was shared through the internet with a cell phone or a landline phone. The findings show huge variations between the subjects in the study, but Theranos failed to adequately explain why there was this variation. Dr. Weber conferred with a colleague who led oncology studies for Pfizer, and they told him they had no interest in using Theranos' technology. Dr. Weber said he spent 50 minutes speaking to Ms. Holmes during a phone call in November 2008, asking questions to try to understand Theranos' roadmap beyond that cancer patient study. And then he went to the company to follow up with several questions. Theranos responded a week or two later, he testified. He did, however, recommend a once every 6 months call with Theranos to reassess the potential for a partnership. So pretty much he didn't completely close the door on ever partnering with them. He just kind of said, at this time, we don't have enough information from you to really make this partnership work. We don't really think the due diligence is there. It could be at some point in the future, but it's not now. I guess Elizabeth did not easily accept this news. So according to an email prosecutors displayed in court, Shane Weber said that I was polite, clear, crisp, and patiently firm as she pushed back. She asked for other names at Pfizer to approach, and I politely deflected. Dr. Weber testified in court that he declined because it would have been poor use of Pfizer resources and his colleagues' time. He also said his supervisors had agreed with his decision to pass on a Theranos partnership. So once again, we see an example here of Elizabeth trying to skirt around rules and just try to go to someone else. You know, this guy at Pfizer denied me, but maybe I can get someone else to do what I want. But, Dr. Weber pretty much said no dice on that approach. So the very last person that we're going to talk about who testified was actually one of the investors. And so he's important because, a lot of this case depends on, investor fraud. So Brian Tolbert, who's the vice president of finance for Texas-based Hall Group, they were a real estate firm that backed Theranos on 2 funding rounds. Apparently, he had secret phone calls of Elizabeth, these investor calls that she made, and there were a lot of claims that she made that we know pretty much are not true, including the fact that, they had partnered with pharmaceutical companies, they were working with the military, things we know pretty much never made it. And also, apparently they had this investor presentation about, the financials of Theranos, and it was all about how, we're gonna hit this goal and be profitable by this amount, and we're gonna make this many $1 million in this year, and we're gonna go public in this year, and none of those things came to pass whatsoever. You could say that this was an optimistic projection for them, but I feel like optimistic is too strong of a word to use because it was so outlandish. If you look at the reality of Theranos' financials, how much money they were spending, the realistic projection for how much money they could make, and what they presented to investors, it was really night and day. So it's just another example of how they were presenting information that, maybe would have looked good, but it's kind of hard to push back on a financial projection for years to come. You can do due diligence to a certain extent, but on the other hand, it's kind of up to the company to also present you with reliable information in that way. Again, kind of going back to the question we discussed earlier, is this the fault of investors for not doing due diligence, or is it the fault of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos for providing them misleading information? So that is where I'm going to leave things for today. Again, like I said, kind of had to cut out some things that I wanted to talk about, but so much happened. This is so long. I'm just going to start doing more regular updates because it was just kind of way too much to go through. But like this video if you liked it. Please subscribe to the channel if you would like more of these types of updates. And like I said, they're going to be a little shorter and more digestible and maybe more interesting, so I don't have to just rush through all of the information. I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.